So 100% of Protestant or Catholic majority countries outside of Africa are highly functional democracies. 100%. 6% of Muslim majority countries are democracies. It's pretty bloody easy for the rich Muslim countries who are absolutely awash in, I would say, undeserved oil money to moralize about the superiority of their culture. I mean, the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia were a little, fringe tribal cult before the West stupidly dumped $1 trillion on them and allowed them to propagandize the entire world. They would have been a backwoods Arab tribe lost in the desert forever if it wasn't for oil money. Well, we don't really understand the relationship between the religious doctrine, let's say, and the fact of these crimes. Now, I want to make two cases here. The first case is that 40 out of 50 Muslim majority countries in the world are authoritarian hellholes, and only 3 of them are democracies. And that's Morocco, Indonesia, and Turkey. And, they're not, I wouldn't put them in the highest echelons of stellar states. And so why is that exactly? Is that a deviation from Islamic principles, or is it a consequence of them? Now, no one wants to have that discussion, and it's no bloody wonder, and then, so that's on the negative side, let's say. And there are certainly doctrines in Islam that are very, very difficult to square with free, liberal, Western, Christian democracies. And those differences aren't just apparent, they're deep. Now, I would say on the optimistic side that we could turn to Islamic leaders like those who run the United Arab Emirates, and even to some degree now Saudi Arabia, and the signatories of the Abraham Accords, to find a different pathway. There have been stellar leaders, both from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who've come out and said that publicly, very publicly, that they've got their Islamic fundamentalists under control and firmly in hand, and are completely undiluted as to their danger. But Europeans are virtue signaling so hard on the progressive side that the fundamental danger from Islamic fundamentalism is going to come from Europe and the UK and not from the Arab states. Now, Tommy Robinson has been pilloried as anti-Islam, but there's a discussion to be had here. And no one wants to have it. And, you said we need a national inquiry. It's like, we need more than a national inquiry. We need something like an international symposium on the relationship between the Christian West and the Islamic world, because there are ugly things afoot, and they've manifested themselves in the most hideous of all possible ways in the UK with regards to these rape crimes and the cover-up. But there's something that needs to be sorted out at the bottom of all this. And one of those is, like, you talk about moderate Muslims. Like, I looked up the polling data today that Winston Marshall, for example, referred to when he interviewed Nigel Farage. And, it's about 3/4 of UK Muslims would be perfectly content if Sharia law happened to be the principle of the day for the UK as a whole. And that it would be fine if Islam became the national religion. Now, that's 75%. So, a cynic would say, okay, just exactly where the hell are these moderates? And at minimum, their voice needs to be amplified. And then we could also point out that the participation in these rapes by members of the Pakistani Muslim community, it was like 1 in 7 of the men in some of these communities was directly involved. And that meant everyone knew about it. Absolutely everyone on the Pakistani Muslim side. And the moderates were certainly, silent and complicit. Now, obviously, so were the authorities. And so that's a complete bloody catastrophe for everyone involved. But there's a serious conversation to be had in the West, and particularly in the UK, maybe France and Germany in secondary place, about just exactly how it is that liberal Western democracies, with their emphasis on the rights of women, can live side by side with Islam in general, especially the sort of Islam that's transformed into enabling fundamentalism that allows this sort of criminality on the part of the psychopathic, resentful psychopathic sadists.
That Jordan Peterson interview, I don't know if there was any of his rules for life that he didn't break during that interview. He probably kicked the cat on the way home. He's really become a sort of embodiment of the West himself, Jordan Peterson. He's like the West incarnate, always telling you how to be while being the opposite himself. The whole interview is a remarkable exercise in just how much dishonesty you can pack into every sentence that you utter. It's really hard to lecture people from inside a bubble, This is the West is starting to understand this. They're starting to experience this. This is the situation for the West, because you literally cannot talk to anyone but each other at this point. You can't talk to anyone else, because to everyone else, you sound like you're absolutely wasted on hallucinogens at all times. And the drug is propaganda. It's indoctrination. It's Alice thinking she's 10 feet tall, you know? For a so-called clinical psychologist, Jordan Peterson shows a stunning incapacity for self-reflection, civilizational self-reflection, you know? I think that he has intelligence. I think he's an intelligent man. And he could be using it for that. He could be using his intelligence for that. He could be using his intellect to actually try to treat what ails the West, because the West is diseased. But instead, he's using his intellect just to compound it. He's just compounding the psychosis and the delusions of his so-called civilization. Because, in fact, he's diseased himself. I mean, the main focus of the interview, the Piers Morgan interview, is actually about how the UK grooms its male population to be groomers and to be rapists, while claiming that this is being inflicted on the UK by immigrants from the Muslim world. That's the narrative that they're trying to push. And about how a convicted liar and a slandering racist, Tommy Robinson, is the heroic champion of this narrative. Peterson doesn't deny that Robinson is a liar. He doesn't deny that he's a serial criminal, but he trusts him nonetheless, which couldn't be more Western. He acts like the 85% of grooming cases don't exist, because those are the ones that are committed by Englishmen. So those don't count. You know, he says that the minuscule number of those cases in which Pakistani Brits were perpetrators, the minuscule number compared to the number that are perpetrated by whites, he says that that represents a sort of an assault by the Muslim world against the genteel, delicate flowers of the European garden. That's it. That's the way he sees it. While he's also articulating very graphically in that interview the West's fundamental thinking about women. He said in that interview that sadistic sexual crimes against women should be understood as the default of human society. Personally, I think it's strange that this remark from that interview didn't seem to get anyone's attention. You know, everyone's talking about what he said about Saudi Arabia and about Muslims and so on, but it's demented what he said. This isn't the way human beings think. This is very Western thinking. It's Darwinian thinking, because you all think that we're animals, and you think that we have to be forced to not behave like animals, to not act like animals. You think we have to be forced not to be savage. You deny the innate nobility and the innate dignity of human beings. And that's why your societies are crime-ridden, and that's why your women aren't safe in your societies. This is the reality of the West, and Jordan Peterson is telling you the presumptions that underlie or that provide the subtext for that sadistic, violent barbarism. They believe that it's human nature. That's the Western position. And he says that Muslims and Islam are fundamentally incompatible or irreconcilable with the West. Well, yes. Muslims and Islam are irreconcilable with sadistic, violent barbarism. That's true. Which you very clearly are not, Jordan Peterson. Since, like I say, Peterson says that the default is violence against women, violence towards women. And he accordingly completely overlooks the overwhelming preponderance of grooming cases in the UK, as if they don't matter. They don't count. And he's completely fine with the fact that a serial criminal and a pathological liar is his primary source of information. His primary source of information about the UK and about these cases. Because that criminal and that liar is telling the lies that Jordan Peterson wants to believe and wants to support and wants to spread. Because those are the lies that cover up the crimes of his own people. It's so Western. He's literally the West incarnate, Jordan Peterson. I'm telling you, for Muslims who immigrate to the West, there's no winning. There's no winning for you with these people. If you stay true to Islam, then they'll blame you. And they'll say that you're trying to change their culture, which desperately needs to be changed. But if you assimilate, on the other hand, if you assimilate with them and act as indecently and as criminally as their culture demands you to act, then they'll blame you for that too, just so that they can make themselves look virtuous by blaming you for doing what they do. Because they're basically just hateful, barbaric, spoilt brats. And that will always come out, no matter how much they try to gloss it over or put filters on it. That will always come out. A chimpanzee can only wear a tuxedo for just so long before he has to rip it off and start throwing feces. And that's what we just saw on Piers Morgan. I mean, look at how Peterson goes off the rails later in the interview when he's talking about Saudi Arabia. He attacks Saudi Arabia. This intellectual titan, you know, Mr. Enlightenment, wagging his finger at the Saudis, claiming that they'd be what did he say? A wandering tribe lost in the desert without their undeserved oil wealth. Look, Muslims need to understand when you're dealing with Western kuffar, you're not actually dealing with ignorance. This is a misunderstanding on our part. You're dealing with arrogance, not ignorance. Ignorance can be remedied by information. It can be remedied by education and so forth. You can teach ignorant people, but you can't teach arrogant people. Arrogant people cannot learn. They can't learn anything until they've been humiliated. And in fact, arrogance is always just the precursor to humiliation. And I think that that's what's happening right now with the West. They're kicking and screaming. You know, the West is kicking and screaming right now against the humbling process that's taking place before our eyes. And that's what Jordan Peterson represents. He represents that kicking and screaming against humility. He's like a child having a meltdown in the aisle of a toy store because he can't have everything he wants. He's like a toddler who's going through breastfeeding withdrawal. This rant that he made against Saudi Arabia just reflects the same colonizer mentality that drove the West through centuries of theft and plunder and genocide. Undeserved wealth, he said. Undeserved wealth. Well, let's talk about undeserved wealth, by all means. Let's talk about Europe. You know, the Europe that Jordan Peterson thinks is the pinnacle of civilization and achievement. Well, Europe would still be wallowing in the mud and battling plagues, and they'd still be tearing each other to pieces in endless wars, internecine wars, continental wars, if they hadn't spent centuries pillaging the global south to make themselves rich. And no, wealth that is obtained through uncivilized means does not civilize you. You got richer, but you sure didn't get better. Your industrial revolution was built on the backs of stolen resources. You have to acknowledge that fact. It was built on stolen resources and enslaved labor. Cotton from India, sugar from the Caribbean, gold and diamonds from Africa, on and on. Entire continents were drained dry to fund Europe's prosperity, not to mention the misery that you inflicted on your own peasantry, on your own workers, creating one of the most ruthlessly classist societies in history. Even at that time, your fancy aristocrats were still defecating right where they stood, in their own palaces. I mean, you were so brutal to each other that your own people ran away from you and started America. That's how that started. They're trying to escape from you. But they were all just people from your same so-called civilization, so they were just as brutal as you. They weren't any better than you. They were escaping from you, but they weren't better than you. They just copied you and they took it even further. I mean, America, land of the free, land of freedom and opportunity. Let's be real. There would be no America without the genocide of the indigenous people, without the theft of their land, and without the transatlantic slave trade. There would be nothing called America today without those heinous crimes. Is that wealth deserved? Is it? I mean, while we're on the topic of oil wealth, let's talk about that. America has recently become the world's biggest producer of oil. They're a net exporter of oil now. That's new because of the so-called shale revolution, the fracking, and so on. I assume that Jordan Peterson considers that wealth to be deserved. That oil wealth is deserved, I assume he thinks. Well, let's talk about America's deserved oil wealth, state by state, massacre by massacre, and theft by theft. Let's talk about Texas, Lone Star State. What do you see when you see a picture of the Texas oil fields pumping millions into the pockets of American oil companies? Well, I'll tell you what I see. I see indigenous genocide. That's what I see. Texas was home to the Comanche. It was home to the Apache. It was home to the Karankawa, the Native American tribes. Well, they were all displaced. They were all slaughtered, or they were infected with diseases by settlers. The U.S. Unilaterally annexed Texas after the Mexican-American War, which is just a war that was built on lies and greed, but that's a whole other topic. That's not wealth that's deserved. That's wealth that's soaked in blood. You can't deny that history. What about North Dakota? That's another fracking area. Same story. Broken treaties, stolen land, massacres like the Whitestone Massacre, systematic destruction of the Lakota, the Dakota, the Mandan tribes, while oil pipelines like the Dakota Access Pipeline desecrates what lands that those people hold sacred, violates indigenous sovereignty. Is that deserved wealth? No, it's theft. It's wealth by deception and violence. What about Oklahoma? You've heard of the Trail of Tears? The Death March, where thousands of Cherokee, thousands of Creek Indians, so-called Indians, and Seminole people, Native Americans, died. That wasn't just a tragedy, it was theft on an industrial scale. They forced Native Americans into Oklahoma, off of their original lands. They forced them into Oklahoma, and then they stole the land that they gave them when oil was discovered there. That's the real story of oil wealth in America, but I assume that that's all deserved. Don't forget about Louisiana, too. Louisiana also is a state that was built on the backs of enslaved Africans. The sugar and the cotton plantations, where human beings were brutalized for profit, to make profit for their owner, so-called, that laid the groundwork for the whole economic system that props up the U.S. until today. And then you have oil coming from Alaska. Well, Alaska was sold by Russia to America without any input from the indigenous peoples who lived there for millennia. only for them to then also be displaced when gold was discovered, when oil was discovered. You know, you had people claiming ownership of land that isn't theirs, selling it to other people who also have no claim on it, and then those people stealing the resources that are in that land for themselves. And nobody cares about the indigenous people. Nobody cares about whose land it really is. This is how you come to deserve your wealth, apparently. You Viking, you marauder. And this pattern repeats everywhere. Colorado, there's the state that I came from. New Mexico, we don't even talk. You want to talk about that. Wyoming, states founded on genocide, on environmental devastation, and relentless exploitation of land and labor. The wealth that America built wasn't earned. It was taken. That's how they earned it. That's how they deserve it, apparently. Stole from the indigenous, from Africans, from Mexicans, from Chinese laborers, from Irish bonded servants and factory workers. Factory workers who were treated like machines. But see, that's how they think. This is how people like Peterson think. This is how Peterson thinks. The extent to which you deserve something, especially wealth and prosperity, success, is determined by just how vicious you can be in acquiring it. And of course, it's determined by your own completely delusional sense of entitlement. You know, again, that's very Western, very European. This notion that somehow everything is supposed to be yours, everything is supposed to belong to you. You think that God accidentally put your wealth and your resources in other people's lands, and you just have to come over there to collect what is rightfully yours. It's been misplaced by God in other people's lands. That's what underlies Jordan Peterson's indignation. Because look, in Saudi Arabia, oil exists under their land. It's theirs. They didn't colonize the world to get that oil. They didn't take it from anybody. They didn't wage any wars to get the oil that's underneath their land. They didn't commit genocide to get the oil that's underneath their land. They didn't enslave entire peoples so that they could claim the oil that's beneath their own land. That wealth came from natural resources which they inherited by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their land, not from the misery of others. But the West can't fathom this. Why? Because their entire empire is built on the opposite principle. Take what doesn't belong to you, then justify it with some twisted sense of moral superiority, just like Peterson is doing in this interview, and then act as if your wealth is the result of hard work and ingenuity and virtue. Again, Peterson is just the embodiment of this. He's the embodiment of this Western hypocrisy. I mean, he didn't become a millionaire by doing what he used to do, rambling on a bad webcam for hours and hours and hours in the middle of the night about myths, about Carl Jung, archetypes in the Bible. He got rich by being Tommy Robinson with a vocabulary and plugging himself in to the so-called intellectual dark web, which in reality is nothing but a bunch of disgruntled Western supremacists reminiscing about how great it used to be, how much better things used to be when their victims couldn't talk back. That's what the intellectual so-called dark web is or was. Like I said, look at this idea of deserved wealth, deserved and undeserved wealth that he's talking about. He brought this up. What would the West look like if they had not colonized the global South? What would Europe be today without the wealth of Africa, without the wealth of Asia, without the gold, without the diamonds, without the spices, without the human labor that they extracted from those colonies? Right? It would just be a collection of small struggling nations, small states. And what would America be without the genocide of the indigenous people? What would America be without the enslavement of Africans? It would be nothing. It wouldn't exist. The Saudis didn't steal their oil. It's their birthright. But America, Europe, well, they looted their way to the top. They looted their way to the top. And even now, they still rely on the same tactics. Military interventions, sanctions, corporate exploitation, just to maintain whatever they still can of their grip on global power. Any wealth that you didn't let them take is by definition undeserved wealth in their view. No, Saudi Arabia deserves their wealth just as much as any country in the global South deserves their wealth. They deserve their wealth. They deserve their resources. They deserve the wealth that comes from their natural resources, the natural resources that are in their lands. The Congo deserves theirs. They deserve to be a wealthy country, but you're taking it. In fact, all the countries that you malign and sneer at in the global South, all your victims whose natural resource wealth has propped up your economies, they all deserve their wealth, but you stole it. They deserve to get it back. Jordan Peterson knows this, of course, but he can't face the reality that his beloved Western so-called civilization is morally bankrupt. So he reflects, in my view, Jordan Peterson, again, he's the embodiment of it. He reflects the deep insecurity of a civilization that knows deep down that its prosperity is illegitimate. Peterson can't accept the idea that a nation like Saudi Arabia can rise on its own terms without Western permission, without Western approval, and without Western exploitation. Because criminal intimidation and bullying is the only card that you've got. It's the only card that the West has got to even try to stay in the game. No, the blood-soaked foundation of your civilization, so-called, absolutely disqualifies you from passing judgment on anyone else's prosperity. You can't stand for a nation to use their resources for their own benefit, to build their own future off of the resources that are in their soil. Like I said, Saudi Arabia didn't steal their oil, it belongs to them. It wasn't stolen, it wasn't plundered, it wasn't wrenched from the hands of someone else at gunpoint, the way that you got your wealth. It's their land, it's their resource, it's their right. Just like the minerals, just like the gold, just like the diamonds, just like the rare earths, just like the oil, just like the gas, and the metals, and the fruits, and vegetables, and spices, and on and on and on. All of the natural resources throughout Africa, throughout Asia, and so-called Latin America, and the Middle East. That's all theirs, not yours. I mean, where do you think your wealth came from? When you talk about your wealth, where do you think your wealth came from? Let's not forget that Western corporations like Shell and BP, for example, used to line their pockets with Saudi oil wealth. They did that for decades. Why do you think that you deserve wealth from other people's resources? This is the question. Why do you think you deserve wealth from other people's resources? When the West was raking in billions and billions of dollars, when Western companies were extracting wealth under exploitative agreements with Saudi Arabia, I assume that was deserved, right? But you just clutch your pearls when the profits aren't flowing in your direction. It doesn't deserve to flow in any other direction. Look at this nonsense he said about Saudi Arabia being a wandering tribe lost in the desert. That's classic Orientalist garbage, reducing an entire people, an entire region, to caricatures of backwardness. I mean, do you even know what came out of the Arabian Peninsula? Islam came out of the Arabian Peninsula. The Arab tribes delivered that religion to the world. And they delivered with it a civilization, a legacy of art and science and philosophy that preserved knowledge when Europe was still burning witches, and when their own filth caused the Black Death. That's what was going on in Europe. That's what came out of Europe. That's what comes by your own natural capabilities. No, the Arabs weren't lost in the desert. They were building cities, and they were building structures. Cities and structures that stand until today. They were founding universities, libraries, centers of learning, advancing mathematics, astronomy, medicine, so on, and engineering. While Europeans couldn't even figure out basic hygiene. Lost? No. The West was lost, and they had to borrow a map from the Muslim world just to find their way out of the Dark Ages, and they still couldn't make it. They're still in the Dark Ages until today. What would Europe look like today without the centuries of brutal colonial conquest? What would Canada look like, Jordan Peterson, if they hadn't wiped out the indigenous people? No, if the West had actually stayed within their borders in Europe and actually traded fairly with people, respecting the sovereignty of other nations, well, they would be nowhere near the global hegemon that they claim to be today. They'd be a backwater. So let's not pretend that this so-called moral high ground that you're standing on isn't in fact a mountain of skulls. You're standing on a mountain of bodies and calling it the moral high ground. And all the wealth that you have today belongs to those bodies. But what exactly is your definition of deserved wealth? Is it wealth that's derived from slavery? From looting, from genocide, from bombing nations into submission? Is it wealth that it gets extracted by force through predatory loans and IMF austerity programs? Is it wealth that's acquired through bullying and intimidation? No, if we're starting to measure deservedness, well, then the West is sitting on the most undeserved pile of wealth in human history. It's stolen. It's blood money. It's the fruit of exploitation. It's the fruit of genocide. It's the fruit of ecological destruction. It's the fruit of oppression, injustice, and tyranny. That's why all these types, all these Jordan Peterson types, why they all rant about so-called open borders, because they don't want the people that they stole from to come over to where they took their stolen goods. Why, if Africans and Asians and Central and South Americans, if they want to come over to America or come over to Europe, well, they're not doing anything but coming over to where all of their own stuff has been displaced. They're coming over to the countries that were built by their own wealth. And if you had any decency, you'd let them in. You let them in. And you let them enjoy what their own wealth and their own resources built. And good Lord, when this man talks about Muslim countries not being so-called democracies, where do I begin? Saying that Muslim countries are authoritarian and so on, as if you have democracies in the West. As if you ever cared one bit about people's rights. As if you ever cared one bit about people's consent, about people's sovereignty, about the popular will. This is what I mean. They can literally only talk to each other at this point because everyone in the world knows. Everyone in the world has suffered your vicious contempt for everyone else's rights. your contempt for everyone else's will, your contempt for everyone else's sovereignty, your contempt for everyone else's consent. Since when did colonizers ever care about the consent of the governed? Did you get the consent of the Native Americans? Did you get the consent of enslaved Africans? Did you get the consent of India when you colonized? Did you get the consent of Algeria? Did you get the consent of Indonesia or Malaysia or Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan? Did you get the consent of Palestine? In fact, what Jordan Peterson can't stand is exactly that these countries are no longer kowtowing to the West. He isn't mad because they're not so-called democratic. No, he doesn't care about that. He's mad because they're no longer obedient, which is anyway what they always meant when they said democratic. What he can't stand is for countries in the Muslim world and for countries in the global South to act with independence and sovereignty. That's what he can't stand. That's what none of them can stand. And he can't stand that no one cares. Literally no one cares anymore what the West thinks. No one cares anymore what the West says. You know, he's saying that we need to have some sort of an international conference or something to have a conversation between the so-called Christian West and the Muslim world. Peterson, we've been having that conversation for centuries, and you've made your point and your position exceedingly and painfully and brutally clear. You've been talking to us with guns and with bombs and with sanctions, with bullying and intimidation, and we're tired of this conversation. No, we don't need to talk anymore. We've heard all we need to hear from you. And we've all recognized that you are all pathological liars and psychopathic narcissists. As far as I'm concerned, our own countries should actually close their borders to all of you. They should definitely close all of their borders to your companies, close their borders to all of your predators, your looters, your pirates, your thieves, your grooming gangs. Oh yes, you send your grooming gangs over to our part of the world all the time. It's called the military. It's called peacekeeping forces. Now I think that there should be rigid restrictions, entry restrictions, in any formerly colonized country against anyone from the countries that formerly colonized them. You can't be trusted. And by your own words, you show that you don't have good intentions. You don't have goodwill towards us, and you don't have good intentions. You don't think that we deserve our prosperity. You don't think that we deserve our own resources that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in our lands. You make it very clear that until today, you don't think that we deserve to use our own resources for our own development and for our own success. You still think that our resources belong to you. So how is anyone supposed to feel comfortable letting you around their stuff? You're kleptomaniacs. No, Jordan Peterson is calling for a dialogue with the Muslim world because that's the only way that the West can try to keep hold of the mic. BRICS has now expanded to comprise countries that constitute the majority of the global population. You're not in the conversation anymore. BRICS is over 55% of the entire world's population. And these countries, Saudi Arabia included, they're building themselves up. They're taking back ownership of their wealth. They're taking back ownership and sovereignty over their resources. And that's what gripes Jordan Peterson. And he wants to pretend that the West enabled that. You know, he said in that interview something about the West giving Saudi Arabia money, $1 trillion, he said. I mean, is he actually talking about Western payments for oil as if it's charity? I mean, look at this thinking. This is psychotic. Look at this mentality. I mean, he probably thinks that even the 50-50 deal that the U.S. used to have with the Saudis back before Aramco was nationalized, he probably thought that even that was unfair. So what about after nationalization? He thinks Saudi Arabia is just supposed to give them the oil and thank America for the privilege. Because the West deserves everything, according to people like Jordan Peterson, always. No, 50-50 was unfair to Saudi Arabia. And in fact, it's unfair for any of your companies to take anything that they extract from our lands, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Congo or anywhere else. Yes, you should get paid for your services like anyone else. But just because you do the service of extraction, you have no claim on what you extract. Giving you anything at all is generous. Letting you take any resources that you extract is generous. I mean, do miners get a portion of the gold or the diamonds or the coal that they dig out of the earth? No. Does someone who digs a well for you get to keep a portion or have a claim upon any portion or percentage of the water in that well for perpetuity? No, you've been shoving exploitative deals down everyone's throat for a long time, and every penny that you've gotten from that is undeserved. But alhamdulillah, things are changing now. And this is why Jordan Peterson is having conniption fits. Because no one needs to take your lopsided deals anymore. Your colonialist fantasies are dead. And no amount of bitter commentaries from the likes of Jordan Peterson are going to bring him back to life. That world doesn't exist anymore. And the real world doesn't need your validation. And the global South doesn't need your permission. And they don't need your approval in order to thrive. Saudi Arabia deserves their oil wealth, and every country in the global south deserves the wealth of their own resources. And Jordan Peterson, you can just cry about it. We know you're good at that. You're always ready to shed a tear for any young white men who feel disenfranchised from their undeserved supremacy. So go ahead and cry about Saudi Arabia's oil wealth that you don't get to take. Because if you took the collected tears of all the victims of the West and unleashed them upon Europe and upon America, well, there wouldn't be a single city that wasn't underwater.